talked about the syndrome that during the last few hundred years, humanity has made very large and very fast changes to the planetary system. We have accelerated the existing flows and introduced many new flows in the planetary physiology, both of energy and materials. And the system today is already outside the normal range that we identified when we looked at the baseline, and that we are in a dynamic transition into something that we could call the post-Holocene, but we don't know exactly yet what this is going to look like. And then in the diagnosis, I showed you that the unlimited access or the access to almost unlimited energy allowed humans to accelerate those flows, particularly the flows in nitrogen and phosphorus, which allowed us to create more food, increase food security, grow the population, and sustain a very rapid population growth and increasing demands. And the new mainstream economic model changed basically the global order and turned humanity into what I call the anthropogenic cataclysmic virus in the Earth's life support system. That's where we are right now, that we have looked at the baseline, the syndrome, the diagnosis. And today we will look first at the prognosis. Where do we think this is heading? What are the next few decades and centuries holding for humanity? And then we will talk about the therapy and how we can do something about if we are heading to a future that we don't want and we want to go somewhere else. So this is a diagram that I showed you twice now. The bottom part is basically, or is the baseline. The large rectangulars are the last 800,000 years, the range of the different variables over the last 800,000 years. And the dark blue ones are the ones for the Holocene. And when we start from the left side, carbon dioxide was in a very small range. Today we are far outside of this range. The same is true for methane, for greenhouse gas forcing, for albedo forcing, and for the global temperature, we are at the upper range of what was happening during the Holocene or during the last 800,000 years. And also for sea level, we are at the upper range. And when we look at where are we heading, what is the prognosis telling us, we can see that we are going to an area where the planet has not been, in many cases, not been in the last 2 million years, and in some cases, not been in the last 60 million years. So we are really taking the planet into a direction where it has never been, and humanity has never experienced the planet in this state. So as a doctor, as I said several times, as a doctor, if I would see a lab sheet for a patient like this and the prognosis would look like this, I would be very worried about my patient here. And then we get very often to see diagrams that scientists create. This one is one from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it shows you the temperature changes from 1950 to 2000 in the dark black line, and in the black line and the gray area on the left side of the diagram. And then it shows the projections. The kind of purple one is the one, if humanity does everything humanity can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then temperature goes probably up 1 or 2 degrees Celsius. And if we are not behaving well, then it goes much higher. And when you see a diagram like that, you really don't fully understand what that means. And that's why I created a very different diagram, which shows the last 10,000 or 12,000 years, the temperature. The area that is between the two broken blue lines is the area that's known to humanity, at least over the last 10,000 years. That's the temperature range we have known on this planet. And then we are outside already a little bit at the present. This is the black dot on the right side. And then when you see this very high line where the bracket is, the post-Holocene is written, that's where we are heading. And then we understand that this small diagram on the left side is not really telling the full story. The full story is we are heading somewhere where humanity has never been, and we have never experienced the planet as warm as it is going to be in the near future. It's not in the far future. It's something, there was a time when I said I don't have to worry about that because my expiration date will be before everything happens. But I realize now by 2050, I will still be around probably. And that is not a very good idea for me to be in a planet that is completely unexperienced and that we are leaving to our children in a way that they have to deal with it. So this diagram on the right side is really telling the full story. We are going somewhere with the planet. Humanity has never experienced and has never been, and the question is, will we be able to handle it? Since you are all a little bit impacted by sea level rise already today, I was going to talk a little bit about what that means for sea level. So we know that 1 degree Celsius in the long term corresponds to about 125 meters in sea level. It takes a very long time for the planet to adjust and have the sea level in equilibrium with the temperature. But we have basically committed already to an ice-free planet. Eventually, the ice in Greenland, on the North Pole and in Antarctica, most of it will melt, and we will see something like close to 200 feet of sea level rise over the next 1,000 to 5,000 years. What that means is, in this century, we might get something between 1 and 2 meters. We cannot exclude 4 meters or 5 meters. The probability that this happens is very low, but it means we cannot really exclude it. And then we basically know that all the protections we have built around our cities that are in the coastal area, this one is, for example, the gates that are in the Thames River in London, they will eventually fail. In some cases, we know it will be around 2050 and 2030, may some of them already fail. And the investment we have made behind those protections will all be lost. But it's not just that they will be lost. We need to think about not necessarily moving out. We need to think about, do we want to build more behind those protections? And I know that countries like the UK and the Netherlands are thinking about whether it makes sense to build higher protections and invest more behind the protections, or whether it makes sense to slowly divest in those areas. And then, of course, we need to think about whether we could have the benefits of living close to the ocean, which has an enormous benefit in many aspects, by building mobile infrastructure and buildings that could be taken out when we have to take them out. And so we have to really think about in a very different way how we settle in the coastal zone. And then, of course, we have already put a lot of garbage into the coastal zone. Waste dumps, landfills are in the coastal zone, and we need to clean up this because eventually all of this will be in the water. And even when we think about building cities in the coastal zone, we have to think about that those cities eventually will be in the ocean. Maybe in 200, maybe in 500 years, but we are leaving all of this to the children, to the generations that come after us, to worry about all the marine debris that we are basically creating today for them to deal with in the future. And for me, this is an ethical question of, to what extent do we want not to look into the future, forget about it, and leave it to the children and their children and their children to worry about what we are doing today when we build cities in the coastal zone. We also need to prepare for the loss of coastal cities. There are economic studies that show that 1.8 meter sea level rise by 2100, 6 feet by 2100, we would lose 36 US coastal cities, would be completely lost, the residential areas, and more than 50 cities would lose more than at least 50% of the residential real estate. And we're talking about trillions in loss of real estate values. When this publication came out 2 years ago, a trillion was still a very large number. Now we are getting a little bit more used to the trillions with the things we have to do about the pandemic. But I think the risk that we are facing here in terms of economic is very high, and we need to think about whether we really want to run into those risks without preparing for them. And many estimates also show that the cost might be much higher than we think today, because we are also losing productivity. Most of the productivity is in the coastal zone, and we are losing this as soon as sea level starts to rise a little bit faster. And when you look at the Earth observations that we have, then almost every year we get more and more publications showing that the ice is melting faster than predicted, faster than expected. So we can really not exclude that we get a rapid and a very fast sea level rise much larger than we think today, or much larger than we would like to see. And then there's something else that I find very interesting, and that's a publication that was published only a few days ago. And the authors looked at the climate niche that humans have been living in. Like every other animal, humans have a preferred climate in terms of precipitation, in terms of temperature. And all these diagrams on the right side show you on the bottom, the x-axis is the mean annual precipitation, and the y-axis shows you the mean annual temperature. And the colors show you where human beings have been living in the upper three diagrams. And 6,000 years ago, most of human beings were living in an area where the mean annual temperature was something between 5 and 20 degrees Celsius, and the precipitation was less than 1,000 millimeters per year. And that was the same 500 years ago, and it's the same today. So we have a niche where we are most comfortable, and it's partly because that's where our crops are comfortable and grow, where our livestock is very happy, and where we can produce a lot of economic growth and things like that. When we look into the future, then we see on the bottom diagram, we see again the temperature range where 6,000 years humans were living, 500 years ago, 300 years ago, and currently. And then when we go to 2070, we see that if people do not move, then most of us will be living in an area that is very different from what is our ecological niche. And the upper diagram basically shows the different curves for the different years, time points that I mentioned. And you can see that the red curve, which is the one for 2070, shows that most of human beings will be living in an area that is far outside of the ecological niche. And when we look at where in the world will the temperatures be at a range and the precipitation be at a range that is not helpful for us, we can see that it's mainly the tropics and the subtropics. And you can see that in the bottom diagram where we see the increase in suitability, the green areas, and the decrease in suitabilities, the red areas, we see that there are some areas in northern United States and in southern Canada and some areas in mainly Russia that are getting better for human beings, more suited for human beings, but very large parts of the world are going to be less suited for human beings. And then we have this question, this publication shows that depending on many population growth and warming, that in 50 years from now, 1 to 3 billion people will be outside of the climate niche for human beings, the area where it's best for us to live. And then the rest who are still inside will have to decide whether they want to let them come in or whether they want them to stay out. Do we want to open the borders? Do we want to close the borders? So we have a huge amount of ethical challenges to face. How do we handle that 1 to 3 billion people will basically live in areas that are not suited for human beings to live in? And then, of course, we think about that is in 2070. But then this study here, again, published a few days ago, showed that there's actually a lot already happening today. And they looked at the wet bulb temperature. The wet bulb temperature determines whether we can cool our body with respiration or whether this doesn't work anymore. If the temperature is higher, it's a combination of humidity and temperature. If this temperature is higher than 35 degrees Celsius, we basically cannot cool our body and we are going to die if we stay outside. And this is something that we thought, scientists thought, would happen probably in 50 years from now. But they looked at data and they showed that there are areas in the world where this temperature has already happened. And we know that lower temperatures are already killing human beings. In 2003, when between 15 and 70,000 people in France and in other parts of Europe died because of a heat wave, it was only on the order of 29 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature. So we don't have to go to the 35 degrees, which is really killing human beings in very short time, to not being able to be outside. It can happen much earlier, and it happened already. So even if the worst cases are going to be in 2070 and beyond, we are already seeing signs of the changes happening today. And in 10 years from now and 5 years from now, we might see much more of those heat waves happening that make it very, very difficult for humans to tolerate. And we also see that the migration is increasing rapidly. I talked about this last Sunday a little bit when we talked about the symptoms and the syndrome. And there are more and more people who can really not live anymore where they are living because the food is not growing, the climate is too severe, the extreme events are happening that are killing people. So we are having this problem of migration already today, but it's going to be much, much worse over the next 50 to 100 years. So looking only at climate is not enough, because we also have the problem that our land use is causing a huge amount of problems. We are losing topsoil, we have a lot of extinction going on, and we are increasingly losing insects, and particularly pollinators that are so important for us in terms of food creation. So there are many, many risks happening. And in fact, more and more institutions are looking at global risks and looking at what might happen from a scientific point of view. And what I want to mention here, without going into the details, is that more and more of those assessments come to the conclusion that human extinction is not that unlikely. It's not very likely, but we cannot exclude it anymore, that the changes we have made to the planet and the changes that are going to come because of what we have done in the past and what we are doing currently might lead to a time where humans basically cannot live on this planet anymore. And I think that's even if the risk, the probability is very small, that's a risk we should not ignore, and we should ask ourselves, what can we do to avoid this very severe outcome? And then there's something that is even making the whole thing a little bit more difficult. And that is that there are what scientists call tipping points. And tipping points are points where the system may jump to a completely different state, not just progress a little bit linearly through time, but change very rapidly into something very different. And this lower left box shows you the cycle in terms of the Earth's system, going from warm periods to cold periods, and then coming back to warm periods and going into cold periods. It's a cycle that's happening on a time scale of 100,000 years. And this seems to be a cycle where there are very few tipping points. And if we extrapolate this into the future, then we see this upper right diagram box that shows the ball, the planet, moving a little bit up to 2 degrees Celsius and then coming back, going back to a kind of a stabilized Earth system and moving around. But if there are tipping points, then it might actually jump to something very different. And we cannot exclude that it actually goes into a hothouse state. And if that would happen, then of course, if at all, we would be only able to survive in very small parts of the planet. And this looks like this. So we have this glacial, interglacial cycle that is happening in the past, and now we are heading into something where the planet is much warmer. And we hope that when carbon dioxide emissions and other things go down, the planet goes back to a stabilized Earth. But there is a potential that we are crossing planetary thresholds that would put the planet into a hothouse Earth. And then life on Earth would be very difficult, not just for human beings, but also for other animals and plants. And then we have to ask, what is this really? Is it the Anthropocene, the epoch of our making? Or is it something that is very different because human beings are no longer around in large numbers to determine where the planet is going? And when you look at this paper, they identify quite a number of possible tipping points that could lead the Earth system to go into a hothouse state. But they don't talk, for example, about the extinction of mammals and birds, the extinction of insects, the loss of soil. So there are many other things that could tip the system into new states that are not comfortable for us. And then there is something that I find is not discussed sufficiently enough, and that is population growth. I made a very important point that because we had access to technology and energy, we were able to change the carrying capacity of the planet. And we introduced industrialized agriculture, where currently we are using about 0.6 parts of fossil fuels to create 1 part of food. So basically, without using the fossil fuels, we would not have the food that we are having currently to feed all the people. And this industrialized agriculture allowed us to to grow population very rapidly. But now we have climate change, we have loss of topsoil, we have loss of pollinators, we have extinction. And all of this eventually will lead to the carrying capacity going down again. But population keeps growing until there's really not enough for anybody. And then the population will break down very rapidly. There are some assessments of what the carrying capacity of the planet will be by 2050 and beyond. And the worst one was done by James Lovelock. And he said that in his assessment, the carrying capacity will be down to 1 billion people by 2050. We will be 9 billion people by then, probably, but only 1 billion can really live on this planet. And so what we are leaving for future generations is the decision who can stay and who has to go. One can stay out of 9 and the other 8 have to go. And I think that's not a reasonable choice we are leaving to future generations. I think we have to really think about what we can do to change that. And again, we think this is all far in the future, but it's not. We saw a few days ago an assessment that the mix of pandemic, unrest, social unrest, climate change in West Africa is putting 40 million people in a situation where they will this year need food assistance. If they don't get food assistance from the rest of the world, many of them will be dying. And so we have to make a decision while we are dealing with the pandemic, whether we want other people to be in much worse situations or whether we want to help them while we are dealing with our own problems. So it's not all in the future, it's already happening today in terms of climate, in terms of the impact of the social unrest that is happening because of climate change, and in terms of other problems that are forcing people to leave where they're living currently. So the prognosis is not a good one. The planet is heading rapidly towards tipping points, and if we cross tipping points, we will be in a very different system state. It may be called the post-Holocene, it may be the Anthropocene, it may even be, and we see signs that it might be going in this direction, something that we could call the Pyrocene, because more and more parts of the world having very large wildfires, and more parts of the world are burning because of those, the changes in humidity and temperature, creating extreme temperatures or extreme weather events for wildfires. And then our knowledge about the trends and the tipping points and the risks is changing rapidly, and the risks are very high. We see this very clearly. So we need to develop some kind of foresight to address those risks and reduce them as much as we can. So being the alien that I introduced at the first, in the first hour when we talked, looking at the system from this alien point of view, we can say that the planetary life support system is rapidly degrading and overheating. The humanity is heading for a monospecies system. We are losing almost everybody else except our livestock on the planet. A few human beings keep accumulating wealth while destroying the life support system for all others. That's a very clear statement that we would see if we look from the outside. The human system knowledge is increasing very rapidly. Scientists, for the first time, really understand what is happening with the planet, what are the levers and knobs and switches that drive the Earth system, but we don't have a control panel. Our governments that are, you could say, the pilots of our spaceship, they don't really know what is going on with the spaceship. They don't have a really nice control panel. And I wouldn't want to be in an airplane where the pilot doesn't have a control panel telling the pilot what is going on with the airplane. But this is a situation our governments have today. And then the alien would really point out that humanity is discounting the future. We don't think about the costs that will come up in the future for future generations, and we only think about the benefit for us today. We don't have a plan where we want to take this planet. We are not getting together and say, where do we want Earth to be in 100 years from now? And there is no planetary governance that could actually make sure that we get to a future that's desirable for humanity. And so that lets us talk about the therapy. And in the therapy, I would like to point out that it's very important to think about ethics, economy, and global governance. So when we talk about the future, there are many different futures that may happen seen from today. We don't know what the future is going to be like, but it's very interesting that there are basically only 4 types of different futures, archetypal types. One is we continue what we are doing today, and we are going into a kind of a projected future based on what we are doing today. And when we realize that that may not be the most desirable one, we might introduce some discipline. We might try to do some small changes to get where we want to get to. And we might also think about that's not enough, and then we might come up with transformation and change the trajectory and the possible future significantly. But most of the, but what is happening is very often is that the things lead to a collapse. And there are increasingly people thinking, some of the big thinkers that we have today, saying that we are not in a position to avoid the collapse at all. And Jem Bendel is somebody who produced, who introduced the term deep adaptation, not just adaptation, but deep adaptation, because he said we will go through a collapse and then we will emerge again as humanity. And the main question we have to already start to ask today is, who do we want to be when we emerge out of this collapse? What are the ethical values and the moral values that we want to take with us and then emerge as a new humanity after the collapse? I found it very interesting that a few days ago, 200 scientists, 200 artists and scientists published this call to humanity, please let's not go back to normal in relation to the pandemic. And in this call, they said that the pursuit of consumerism and our obsession with productivity has led us to deny the value of life itself. And I think that's a very profound statement, very important. And they say the radical transformation we need at all levels demands boldness and courage. And for me, one of the things that the pandemic seems to have taught us is that if we need to change, we can change. We can make changes that a few months ago, nobody of us would have thought would be possible, or not many of us. And so we have really learned something. We can make the transformation if we understand that it is necessary. So before I talk about the transformation that I think is necessary, a few more words about what humanity is doing. In 2015, I actually wrote this column where I thought things are really going in the right direction. And the main reason I thought this was that the United Nations agreed on the agenda for sustainable development with 17 really great sustainable development goals. Humanity came up with the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, and we went into the Paris Agreement to do something about climate change. And we have a lot of other things where thinkers are talking about what we need to do, leaving half of the planet for other life, not just for us, going for prosperity without growth. Thinking about all these different things. There's a lot of work being done to develop the spectrum of possible futures and to identify the desirable and those that are not desirable. And then, of course, Jem Bendel with deep adaptation is there preparing for the time after the social collapse. So we have to ask the question, can the success story of Homo sapiens actually going to be continued? And for that, I would like to say that I tried to show you the importance of flows. If you think about how things are going between the Earth's life support system and humanity, then the strategies for sustainability really are to consume only nature's flows while conserving the stocks. So we should not reduce the natural capital for our purposes, but we should use what comes from the Earth system as a kind of an interest. And we should focus on increasing society stock, human resources to civil institutions, and limit the flows of material and energy. So it's not just important to, for example, go from fossil fuels to renewable energy, it's important to limit the flow of energy. So when we think about that, being a species that has unparalleled power to grow and has basically removed all the limitations that we have removed, all the predators that were eating us, they are gone. We have removed many other things. Food security is very high. So we can grow and grow and grow and grow. And if you are in this situation, you must exercise self-limitation. You cannot grow beyond up to every limitation that comes from the outside. So that requires a small family ethics, and it requires responsible procreation, and it also requires a limitation of wealth creation and accumulation without thinking about the Earth's life support system. And that brings me to the last point that I wanted to make again, the importance of the mainstream economic model. I told you that in 1776, Adam Smith introduced the purpose of economy to be increasing human wealth. And he basically, he explicitly pointed out that the Earth and its natural wealth is infinite, and we don't have to worry about taking out from the planet whatever we want because it's infinite. So we cannot really reduce the natural capital. And then when we realized that things were not going in the right direction, in 1987, a United Nations World Commission on Environment and Development came up with the definition of sustainable development. And they said sustainable development is one that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And we thought that was a very good idea, but it was very difficult to come up with an operational way of looking at this statement. How do we actually do that? And in 2013, in this paper, a new definition was given of sustainable development as a development that meets the needs of the present while safeguarding Earth's life support system on which the welfare of current and future generations depends. And suddenly we have a very operational statement here. We have to safeguard the Earth's life support system if we want to be sustainable. And I showed you that there is a relationship between society and the Earth's life support system, which goes through economy. We talked about this in last week. And that means that humanity needs an economy that meets the needs of the present while safeguarding Earth's life support system on which the welfare of current and future generations and all human and non-human animals depends. So we have to make it the purpose of economy to safeguard the Earth's life support system. That's a fundamental transformation of what we have today. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, do we have the global governance and the national governance to transform the purpose of economy? Can we really do that, redefine what economy is actually about? And then, of course, do we want to transform the virus that we have become in the Earth's life support system into the healer? If we do this with economy, I think we would be the healer. We would safeguard the Earth's life support system. And that would basically be, economy is the planetary medicine. It's helping the planet to survive. And all these questions have very deep ethical components in it. And we have to ask ourselves, can we do it? And do we want to do it? Do we want to do it is the ethical question. So, and that's more or less the last slide. In terms of mitigation, I think we, of course, need to do everything we can to reduce climate change. We need to reduce the flow in the Earth's life support system, and we need to reduce population growth. I was a little bit shocked when I thought about the pandemic and realized that in the worst case, we might have 20 million additional deaths because of the pandemic globally, if it goes really very bad. But that would only reduce the 80 million that are going to be population growth in this year, in this year, to 60 million. So despite the pandemic, we would still grow by 60 million. So we eventually need to reduce population growth and population. And in terms of adaptation, we need to prepare for an unknown planet with heat waves, cold spells, storms, droughts, extreme rain events, new pandemics, all of this. And then we need to be ready to move what some of us call lifeboats. But these are the areas higher above sea level and to moderate climates. How do we actually allow people to migrate from where life is no longer possible to areas that are lifeboats? Preparing for large-scale migration, social unrest, I think we need to do that, and we need to somehow be clear about how we want to handle those things. And aiming for a sustainable future requires that we change the purpose of economy. We cannot make the purpose of it or keep the purpose of economy as creating more and more human wealth. And then we need to limit the consumption of to the planetary interests and not take the stocks anymore. So the current pandemic, in my opinion, is a very minor stress test compared to what the future may hold for us. So we probably need to prepare ourselves for situations that are far more difficult than the current pandemic that we are going through. As the alien, I would now leave and would hope that humanity would have learned something. And I leave you now from with the last slide, collecting all the points that I made over these 3 Sundays. And now I'm taking questions if you want to ask any questions.
We have about 5 minutes left. Dr. Plag, this has been really extraordinary. And I would, if you would like to unmute now and ask Dr. Plag any questions that you might have, or doubts or pushback. And I just want to make sure you are unmuted now. Everyone could unmute.
Can you?
Yeah, I can hear you, Mariana.
I think that was someone else, but I will go ahead and express my concern. Obviously, I don't understand all of this, but I'm really concerned about this issue of population control. I know that I can't get wrap my brain around all the changes that may happen. And I really, what I like about what you've said is this idea that we really need to be much more intentional than we've been. And that we must be more thoughtful. Our country and other countries have been so oriented towards this idea of the great American dream that we accumulate. And I totally get that we move away from that. But the idea of population control really scares me. I don't like the idea of governments getting into the idea of controlling family decisions. I think of China, where they had limits on how many children a family could have. That, to me, doesn't seem to be the first thing we should be talking about. Maybe I'm wrong, but to me, it seems like the first thing we need to be talking about is bringing down that energy use. And thinking maybe there are more creative ways that we can be taking care of the people. And we should be starting with definitely getting away from that accumulation idea as I look around at all my stuff, to be quite honest. So I know you've been studying it a long time, and I haven't. But I do not trust our current government one little bit with this phrase, population control. I would not want our current government hearing that at all, because it's acting in a very racist way already. Yeah. And I don't trust this concept. So,
Dr. Plag, could you respond?
Yeah, I think I'm very glad that you brought this point up, because I never used the word population growth control. Yeah. I used changing the ethics of procreation, the morality of procreation. So this is an attitude that people need to have. It's not something that can come from the government. I think the way that China tried to do it by controlling it is not working. It only works if we realize that having more than one child in a family is unethical. Then we have to ask our question, do we want to be unethical? There's a very good book written by a bioethicist at Johns Hopkins, Tim Reeder, and he wrote the book about the small family ethics. He looked at climate change and realized that climate change is related to population growth. So the more population we have in the way we live today, we have more climate change. And then he applied two ethical principles. One, we have a duty not to participate in massive harm. And I think that's something that most religions would agree to, and most ethical people would agree to. We should not participate in massive harm. And then he looked at, we have a duty to justice. We want a just society. What we don't think a society full of injustice is a good one. And then he showed that having more than one child in a family today is actually leading to massive harm in the world, because a child has a much larger carbon footprint and a much larger impact on everything than the parents themselves. And it creates injustice. And so he came up and said, we need to have a new morality where it is not considered to be morally justified to have a large number of children. And maybe we should stop giving rewards to families who have a lot of children and give rewards to people who are willingly give up their right to have children. It's not about a law. It's not about control. It's about motivating people to do the right thing. And the right thing today is not to have too many children. Nobody is saying that we need to control it. And I think that's very important to make clear that I think that the religions have to play a very important role here.
Yeah, I would agree, Dr. Plag. I hate to interrupt, but we have to go into a different meeting. But I would like to continue this conversation, and I will talk with our Caring for Creation and also you, Dr. Plag, if maybe we could have a discussion group at some time in the near future too, where people could respond to you and explore this, because I agree with you completely. I think I've come to the conclusion myself that the church, well, not just the church, I would say the major religions have been part of the problem, because we've been operating on a very old paradigm, and that our understanding of ethics and morality really must change at this point. And the church should be leading this, not fighting it as it has been. And so that's something that we can continue to talk about here. But Dr. Plag, thank you so much for your time with us. We will not have a class next week. It's Memorial Day weekend, but the following week, we are going to continue to talk about this whole the ethics of this. And I've invited Rabbi Michael Panitz from Temple Israel to come and talk about this. And I've asked him to review our recordings of your lectures, Dr. Plag, before coming to talk with us. And so I'm hoping that what you brought will stimulate ongoing conversation, because I think in some ways our concept of ethics has to really shift. But when in the Episcopal Church, we talk about in the baptismal covenant to strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being. And I've thought about dignity in terms of the dignity of future generations.
Yeah.
And that to respect the dignity of every human being means to put limitations on our own cravings and our own sense of entitlement. So Dr. Plag, I will be back in touch with you about possibilities of future conversation, because I think it's very important. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It was really a nice experience.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.